Good morning, everyone from Brussels, dear participants and speakers. Welcome to the European Policy Center. This is a first in a series of events that we decided to develop and host that is looking at and revisiting European Union and UK relations. And we want to explore in this session the possibilities of deeper cooperation in defense and security. As you will all be aware of, this is no subject that is new to the European Policy Center. We have been working for many years over the past decade on many of the aspects that took the United Kingdom further away from the European Union. And we want to better understand now what a rapprochement, a collaboration can look like at a point in time when, needless to say, we are challenged, in particular with regard to European security. So this series wants to understand various angles of potential cooperation in the future in the EU, strictly speaking dimension, but also in a wider European dimension. This will not only include security and defense, but also trade and investment, education and culture, and an outlook in a sort of more comprehensive way on things global to understand where the Union and the United Kingdom might be aligned or not. And so you can see from the fact that we start off this series with security and defense that we place a high importance on this subject matter. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our excellent speakers here to the podium. And I warmly welcome Richard Whitman, a professor of politics and international relations at University of Kent. Professor Whitman is currently a senior fellow on the Economic and Research Council's UK in a Changing Europe initiative, a senior associate fellow at the Royal Institute, United Services Institute at RUSI, and of course, someone very familiar in our setting. We're very happy, Richard Whitman, to have you back with us. Prolific writer, very experienced, including on another book that you've yet completed, looking at the UK's perspective on European security in light of developments of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. It is very good to have you. A warm welcome to you. I'm also delighted to be joined by Dr. Juha Jokela, who is joining us from Helsinki this morning, the Program Director of the European Union and Strategic Competition Research Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Also someone we're very happy to see in the European policy circle of colleagues that we've worked with. Juha Jokela has done extensive research both on things European, Finnish perspectives, but also on the United Kingdom's leaving the European Union. And we are very happy to have you as someone who has been following for many decades these developments. And from a Finnish perspective, of course, European security is something that also feels very urgent. Juha, it is very good to have you with us. Let's just make sure that everybody is aware what we're going to do. We're going to have a conversation between the two speakers that I will mildly chair. And then, of course, as always, you will have the opportunity to engage with your questions. I would like just to ask you to keep them relatively short and concise so that we can make sure that colleagues can pick up as many as possible. And would you please be so kind and write them in the Q&A section here on your screen. That will help us address them as the conversation flows. So let me just start and go to you, Richard Whitman, in trying to understand what is the security outlook of the United Kingdom about European security at this point in time. A lot of emphasis, of course, is on the relatively still new government in London under the leadership of Prime Minister Starmer. But what are some of the broader lines? What is the way that those in charge will be looking at the security situation in Europe, and what does that mean for the engagement of the United Kingdom at this point in time?
Well, thank you very much for letting me join this discussion, and I appreciate that you're willing to devote the time to the UK. Bearing in mind there are obviously plenty of other agenda issues in Brussels that grip people. I mean, I think it's interesting where we are after the general election in the UK. This general election obviously came earlier than most commentators had expected, and came earlier than the Labour Party itself had expected. So I think, they are still in a position in which they're sort of bedding in. But I think there are two things to note, really. One is the high degree of continuity in the broader foreign policy perspective. And that's primarily because the government inherited, obviously, Russia's war in Ukraine and the UK response, which it has reinforced and recapitulated UK government policy. So no change there. And obviously, the war in the Middle East also, which is sort of part of its foreign policy inheritance, where it has much less of a role and is much more of a bystander. But those are two big foreign policy events which it has inherited. On the relationship with the EU, as we've already seen, the Labour government has a plan, if you like, in terms of its ambition to alter the relationship. And there, I guess the most eye-catching thing, and gets us to our discussion this morning, is the proposition of a security pact, and we can unpack the pact as we go along. But that has been part of the Labour prospectus, and I think we could take that as reading that the EU, first of all, the sort of political fever in the UK is broken. We've got a bit more of a normal politics in the UK, but I think there's a bit more of sensible thinking about how the EU fits in terms of the European security order. And that means that the UK needs to have a developed and well-working relationship with the EU. But, it's very early days, I think, and that's why this discussion is so timely.
Can you just follow up on one aspect, particularly, Richard, and that is on the question to what extent there is room for maneuver, politically speaking, for the government to embrace things EU-European, because this has been so divisive for so many years, probably less, as you're describing, in the community of experts and foreign policy makers, but more so amongst the wider public. How risky was it by the Prime Minister kind of move forward, draw a line on the one hand and saying, we're never in my lifetime going to rejoin the union and the single market and all of that. But how much room for maneuver does the Prime Minister have in addressing things, more strictly speaking, EU-European, or is there the likelihood of things breaking up again pretty quickly if things move ahead too fast? How much does that have to be a concern?
I think it's a really interesting question, because we could perhaps understand how the government may have approached the general election campaign, in terms of wanting to close down the issue of the relationship with the EU, but it makes no sense in terms of the long-term politics, frankly. And having drawn again red lines, I thought perhaps red lines had disappeared from the vocabulary of British discussions on the EU, but having redrawn red lines in terms of the UK thinking about an EEA-style relationship connection to the single market in that way, or customs union membership. I mean, these are pretty big red lines to draw. And so I think it obviously circumscribes the degree of possibility, frankly, in terms of the broader ambition for the relationship. And that's why I think your question is a good one. Does that position alter? And what we do know about the Labour Party is that broadly the Labour Party and the backbench Labour Party is much more pro-EU, shall we say, than the outgoing administration. There is a very vocal and quite large lobby within the Labour Party that's seeking a different kind of relationship with the EU. And I think for those reasons, the Prime Minister's line is probably going to have to alter at some point. But it depends on the level of ambition that he has as a Prime Minister, particularly in his first term. But I also think it depends a bit on how Brussels puts the UK in a place in which it has to make decisions, frankly, because probably the most comfortable place for the UK to be is if it's not being pressed particularly hard on some of the choices that it needs to think harder about. And in a way, that's over to the, inside the Brussels Beltway to think about how much time it wants to devote to the UK and how it wants to think about a sort of strategy towards the UK going forward.
Absolutely, and I'll bring that to Juha in a second, but just in our little mapping exercise of where the UK is at, I just also would like to understand a little better where in your assessment the sort of EU-NATO bilateral piece fits in, and what is probably the thinking surrounding the Prime Minister on these questions, because needless to say, I mean, there is a very clear division of labor, and the strength of the United Kingdom in strengthening the alliance, NATO, is a very relevant one. And we know it's an old story to discuss, but to understand a little bit better what the reasoning is, there are a lot of elements apart from the EU angle, of course, that require attention. Where is the emphasis in London right now?
Well, historically, obviously, the UK has always felt more comfortable with the Atlantic Alliance and NATO than it has really it's had a clearer strategy there than it has for the EU, frankly, or did even as a member state. And of course, a significant challenge to the alliance comes from the outcome of the US presidential election. And that's something, the British government is going to be very, very gripped by. And I think we probably have to appreciate that if we have a Trump presidency, then the UK is going to devote huge amount of diplomatic bandwidth to managing that. And that may or may not come to the cost of how much energy and effort it wants to devote to the EU relationship. And the extent to which it sees that as sort of complementary, if you like, to the solution of how we manage Trump, which will be a major order foreign policy and security policy challenge. But I think that also then gets to the UK sort of bilateralism. I mean, there is a great deal of continuity in British policy towards European countries in the past. What a colleague of mine called a promiscuous bilateralism. There is an enthusiasm on the part of British governments for bilateralism. And there's an enthusiasm for many bilateralisms. We've also seen, I think, as part of the process that the UK has thought about European enthusiasm for minilateralism, the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, being a very nice example of that. And perhaps one thing we might want to think about is that through the Brexit process, the UK has found, I think, an alternative to EU foreign policy cooperation that it likes, which is the G7 framework. And, the G7 has been really significant in driving Ukraine policy. It's really been, I would say, the primary body for sort of driving the West policy on Ukraine. And, the UK obviously sits within the G7. And I would say, as a sort of observer of UK foreign policy, the great unexpected for me really was the significance and importance of that as a vehicle for the UK pursuing its policy, not as a substitute for EU membership, but as a very effective alternative venue for sort of doing big foreign and security policy. And in a way, it's compensated a little bit, but it does give the UK a sort of place that it can go to and to feel relevant, which I think we should acknowledge the UK has adjusted itself to quite effectively, frankly.
Let me bring this now to Juha and see, with Richard having done the mapping with a lot of elements already, and we'll of course come back to the US elections and go more granular in some of the issues that you raised. From the vantage point of the European Union at the beginning of the new legislative cycle, with the Commission President putting together the team and placing emphasis on security and defense, how do you add sort of the EU-European perspective to this? How is the outlook on security and defense, the ambition that we've talked about a lot here in Brussels, of course, over the past weeks? What does this look like from your vantage point, Juha? And then also the question, why is Brussels interested in bringing the UK in? Seems to be an obvious question to put, because there is so much in that relationship because of the weight of the UK in security and defense. But of course, there is also a history to recent relations, which is not an easy one. for those of us who have followed UK-EU relations in the course of the Brexit, etc. So, you know, what is the EU perspective? And of course, since you are sitting in Finland, add also the perspective of a member state who is at the forefront of European security and defense, Juha.
Thank you, Almut, and very nice to hear also Richard's analysis from London. I think you're completely right in a way that the security and defense, and I would say perhaps more broadly, security is now the name of the game in town in Brussels and many capitals as well. If you look into the von der Leyen's mission letters after 2019 elections, we talk about the Green Deal and climate. Now security is the kind of the glue, what holds together different portfolios and so forth. And of course, in this context, we also have the war in Europe and also significant pressures related to the defense sector, ramping it up and so forth. So I think this is obviously something what the new Commission, what this institutional cycle will work on. And in addition to that, obviously, there is then the more competitive strategic environment within which the EU and the UK as well finds itself in terms of economy. And I think the question that we've been addressing all along during the Brexit process is to what extent UK is a strategic competitor or a strategic partner for the EU. And I think it's very clear, given also the recent developments and the kind of the joint aspiration to support Ukraine within the Western community, also the G7, which was mentioned here, that the UK and EU are obviously strategic partners in terms of European security, Russia's war of aggression, and of course more broadly, given the changes in the world. But where the question is still sort of relevant and unsolved is, of course, then the broader partnership, and to what extent in terms of economy and other important files, the UK is still the kind of potential or the competitor for the EU. I think there's also an important element in this kind of environment where the new government in London is seen, I would say, throughout the Union as fresh air, as kind of a possibility to seize the moment and build a kind of a pragmatic relations after the thorny questions related to the Brexit and as well as the conservative government's rhetoric and policy positions. Although, of course, it was already mentioned that there is also the kind of developments which relates to the government of Rishi Sunak in particular, in a way that this process has already started before for the Labour government. But I think this is really a kind of a moment to seize. But what I'm a little bit worried from an EU's perspective or the member states' perspective is that to what extent the Union has political energy and capacity to invest in building that relationship. In particular, if some of the thorny questions that kind of featured very high in the Brexit process and negotiations are kind of brought back to the table. And in my view, and looking the EU from here, from Helsinki, the EU's agenda is so full of huge challenges as well as threats. And I think the member states are kind of now positioning themselves to the kind of anticipated developments coming from the new institutional cycle. And there might be very little political energy and capital to actually invest in sort of the most difficult questions related to the EU-UK relations. So I suspect that the EU's approach and the member states' approach is also rather pragmatic, finding a kind of policy files like security and defense, where there might be sort of low-hanging fruits to achieve. And then the question to how far the EU and UK are able to move on, reaching something a bit more ambitious, also in the field of security and defense. I think what we will discuss depends quite a lot also on the kind of the EU institutions' positions in that process. And I think here, what the new government in London has done is something which is very clever. They are clearly refocusing on the European Commission, as well as the High Representative Vice President this week. I think this is clearly seen now in London as they are seen as the key interlocutors. And when looking back to the process of Brexit as well, I think this is a clearly important shift in UK policy. Because if we think about these thorny questions that might lie ahead in looking this joint agenda of improving the relationship, I think it's the Commission in particular which will have a pivotal role in assessing the possibilities, as well as assessing the potential solutions, as well as, in a way, what might politically fly within the EU in improving that relationship.
Thank you, Juha. You're raising a whole number of entries into this complex relationship in light of a very challenging security situation. And I want to go a little bit deeper into the EU internal piece for a moment. Not because we should be navel-gazing, we've done that far too much probably. That was a mistake that contributed to the UK leaving the European Union, so we should make that mistake again, I guess. But what I would like you to explore a little bit is, and help us assess the inner tension that is within the moves of the European Commission and Commission President von der Leyen herself, who is throwing all her weight behind a stronger role for the EU in security and defense, has nominated a defense commissioner that will work very closely with the High Representative. She's clear in her mission letter that she wants deliverables within the first 100 days. She talks about defense procurement, a single market in defense. We know that there's a lot of tension in there when it comes to, negotiating this with member states. So this piece of the internal EU puzzle between the EU level and member states, who are, including your own country that has recently joined NATO, who are, of course, looking at this not all in a unified manner. How difficult will it be to be a partner for the EU beyond what you describe, I guess, as the level of politically it's the right thing to do, to engage and to meet? How much controversy is already within the EU and how risky is that to then reach out to a partner that actually might become disappointed again, because ultimately it's about deliverables in terms of strengthening European security?
Yes, I think it's a real risk. I think it's always, as we know very well in a way, what kind of negotiating partner EU is more broadly. It's the most difficult task to find the common position often among the 27, used to be with the 28. And then, of course, the kind of the criticism what often is heard from the partners who are negotiating, that this position is not negotiable anymore. This is the best what we can offer. So I think this plays very well into the current situation as well in the EU, that there are these very difficult questions related to the security and defense file. In my view, I think there are two key elements of this, and I think where the consensus among the member states might emerge. The one, I think, which is the kind of the hardcore of the security and defense file is the European defense industrial base. And I think this is obviously something where we've seen a lot of development and there are high expectations. We know how difficult and to some extent divisive issue this is among the member states. The different views and different positions have come forward also during the recent years. When European instruments have been used, how those have been approached by the member states. but nevertheless, I think the general picture, in a way, of using the EU tools to build up European defenses and the defense market and the defense industrial base behind that is something which is now very much in the discussions and among the priorities, and moving that forward is something which, to some extent at least, is kind of expected. But then, of course, in the security and defense, there is another side of the coin, and I think this is also something what is expected to feature quite high in the President Sauli Niinistö's forthcoming report on EU and security, and that's of course the broader security questions related to the preparedness, resilience, and other parts of security. And this is of course the field where the EU has a lot of tools also in comparison to the other actors, organizations like NATO, to build up resilience and preparedness, security of supply. So in my view, or my analysis of the second von der Leyen Commission, I think this kind of broader security agenda, which is also very cross-cutting within the Commission and more broadly in the EU, is a kind of another part of that. And then when we bring in the kind of the possibilities and also challenges that kind of moving forward with the EU-UK relations might hold, I think there are clear one can clearly see kind of advantages of deepening the relationship between the EU and UK in terms of the defense cooperation, defense industrial base developments, but also in this kind of a broader security agenda that the Union is now working on. The kind of the argument or the analysis that I try to provide is that there are potentially limits to that, and your question whether there is yet another kind of a disappointment emerging in the UK is that the EU is indeed very preoccupied with its internal processes to push forward this agenda, and this is something that has to keep in mind in a way when one thinks that to what extent the EU is able to move in this equation when they're in terms of the more sort of a thornier questions related to the EU-UK relationship. So I think there are clear possibilities. I think this kind of ethos, what we now hear from both sides, the kind of the pragmatic approach, also the kind of the recent decision by the new UK government to focus on the institutions, the Commission and the High Rep, they are all very welcome. And I think this kind of provides the context, and the recent meetings already provides the context within which this joint agenda can be explored. Also the kind of the risks, as well as the potentially low-hanging fruits that could kind of lead then to more ambitious agenda are kind of explored by both sides, and there clearly seems to be a willingness to do this as well. So in that sense, I think there are some possibilities.
Yes, thank you. Can you just ask for your assessment, just in a kind of short way, on before I bring it back to Richard, on the other piece of the puzzle? Because arguably, if the European Union and the UK would want to get it right with one another, there is a strong element that speaks for getting it right in the sort of broader NATO context. How optimistic are you that with the new leadership in NATO and Mark Rutte having taken his position, someone who knows well the internal EU dynamics, and an orientation, I would say, of a country that was hugely in favor of good relations with the United Kingdom in the past. How optimistic are you that some of the hiccups, I wouldn't call them. I mean, big difficulties in, complementing NATO EU ambition can be made productive this time round, because I think that would be a precondition. Just in a kind of quick assessment, temperature assessment, are you more positive? Are you kind of wary, or do you think it will be more of the same? And then we bring it back to Richard. And I see also questions coming in, which is great. And I will weave them into the conversation. Philippe Lefebvre, I will be picking up you in a second.
I tend to be more positive this time, and of course, Finland is a new member in the NATO and alliance, and there's maybe a history to that as well, in a way that, of course, before joining NATO, Finland was one of the strong proponents of a stronger EU security and defense, including the broader features of EU security activeness. And I think it's also now, as a new member of the alliance, highlighting very much the complementarity of the EU and the NATO, and potentially also the changed security environment with Russia's aggression and the return of the war in Europe, obviously plays into that as well. And in my view, I think the having UK in these discussions obviously is an asset as well, to smooth out some of the well-known and well-established dividing lines related to this question. And I think it's also very important in terms of, the approaching US presidential elections. We don't know yet what kind of administration will emerge.
Yes.
But in a way, also bringing, providing communication and also providing this bridge, I would think, also within this transatlantic relationship from Europe to Washington. I think this is also highly important, because I think we were all surprised when the worries related to the duplication re-emerged during Donald Trump administration. I think many of us thought that the kind of the annexation of Crimea, as well as all the developments in the EU related to the defense cooperation as well as defense industry, were something which were understood also in Washington already during the Obama administration and pivot to Asia. But this could resurface very easily, and I think UK is also a key player in this, and could be an asset actually for the EU aspirations.
Absolutely, yeah, and we should be getting onto this. It's also a question that is being asked in the chat by one of our participants here: the dynamics that might unfold in the US presidential elections. So thank you, Juha, for bringing that up. I want to take it back to Richard, and you started already in your mapping to talk about the more specific things that the UK might want to get out of a cooperation with the European Union. You mentioned the security pact. We have here Philippe Lefebvre, who is joining us from Warsaw this morning with the British Chamber of Commerce, and I'm just reading his contribution. They are there ahead of the Polish presidency. The trio coming up with Poland, Denmark, and Cyprus is quite favorable to EU-UK cooperation. Do you see this being able to set a positive foundation with the upcoming EU-UK security pact / agreements, Richard? Then, of course, feel free to respond and pick up on where Juha gave a European perspective, but I'd be really interested to hear where you think, what are expectations that would the UK government want to see with regard to that collaboration with the European Union?
Thanks. There are so many things we could pick up. I mean, this is such a fascinating discussion, and I'm sorry we only have an hour, but maybe just to pick up on this question. I think on the question, and also picking up on the point that Juha and you've also made, Almut, is that we need to avoid the danger of disappointment. I mean, I think the political stars are really well aligned, both in terms of the fact that the Labour government has set it as a priority to improve the relationship more generally, but has put forward a proposition, a concrete proposition, which is to have a formal relationship in the area of security. And we appear to have a very good personal working relationship between Starmer and VDL. We have already this week, had this work put in place in terms of David Lammy attending the FAC, and also now a bit of a roadmap for how the EU and the UK are going to talk about foreign policy with, formal dialogue put in place. I mean, those are all good, sensible, and what I would call good diplomatic hygiene arrangements. These need to exist as a matter of course. But how we break out and go beyond that, I think, is the really important thing, because there is a danger that we lose traction, and there's a danger that we lose ambition. And I fully recognize Juha's point that, I mean, Brussels has lots of other things to do. But the number one thing that we all have to do is European security. And so, that's where there is, in your words, we sort of re-established the nature of the partnership. I would suggest even more that actually we need to think much more clearly about it as an alliance relationship. And if you have an alliance relationship, it serves multiple purposes, but it has as a very, very strong underpinning a strong and clear purpose. And we have that purpose, frankly, which is how to secure Ukraine. And, European security is determined by what happens in Ukraine. So I think that couldn't be a better context in terms of thinking about how we work together. And I would add, from the UK perspective, the UK has a major stake in the success of the EU's security and defence policy developments. Perhaps a little bit more ambivalent on defence industrial, which we come back to, but it has a major stake in the EU being successful, but it has no say, and it's not going to have a say, of course, by being a non-member. So how do we reach that sweet spot where we give a relationship to the UK, meaning Brussels gives a relationship to the UK, which is a meaningful and tangible one, which is probably a bit more than, let's say, pulling out an existing framework that exists, an existing template, but also I think recognizes the new reality of European security. And in a way, that's where the level of ambition has to be raised in Brussels, frankly. And, to put a sort of slightly discordant note in, the fact that, we're still arguing about whether or it still hasn't happened that the UK is going to join the military mobility project under PESCO is ludicrous, frankly. I mean, that's small beer. It's not a good indication of where we start to get into much trickier stuff. But I just put that on the table, that stakes are too big to let the small stuff get in the way, frankly. So where do we go from here? Well, this sort of lineup of future presidencies is ideal, I think, in terms of putting the energy into things. The fact that there are other structures where the UK talks about security with others, like with Finland through the GEF, for example, means that we've got there are lots of places where these discussions are happening. But what we need to do, I mean, my own view is that we need to very quickly, very swiftly move towards a declaration where we set out a high level of ambition, and then from that we work the problem, frankly. But I think we need some kind of high level, the equivalent of the transatlantic declaration, if I could put it in those grand terms, where it really says unequivocally, this is the nature of the relationship, why it's important, why security is pretty central to it, and then we move on and think about the specifics, because there are other things going on in other places like NATO, which obviously impinge on that relationship. But we need to set a high level of ambition politically, and I think that would respond in a way to the UK desire to see something happen. It would then, in a way, allow us to start to put some substance to this idea of a security pact, to move it on to, I think, the language in the press statement between the High Rep VP and UK Foreign Secretary this week was security partnership. What do we mean by security partnership? How are we going to flesh that out? How it's going to cover multiple aspects of security, and also to put a time frame on it, because I think that is also something quite important, to think quite hard about how quickly we want to do some of these things and what things we want to prioritize. And for me personally, top of the list should be anything that increases the level of support we should give to Ukraine, and how we can organize that more effectively together needs to be at the top of the list, frankly.
Can I just, Richard, I really also like your way in which you talked about this relationship having to morph into something different, and that is an alliance mode. It was a membership mode. It was a difficult exit mode, and sometimes I think I wouldn't underestimate also some of the damage that was done here and there in institutional memory of that time. But in agreement with you saying it's about European security, there is clearly no choice. What are the risks or the entailed in becoming an alliance relationship, and would it also help to kind of place that in the wider context of the EU-European pillar in NATO, because that is so much more, that mode of working with one another. And I would also like to ask you about some of the issues that Juha was also skeptical about that would be difficult, on the defense and industrial base questions. Arguably, there is a bit of a difference because the EU has a single market of which the United Kingdom is no longer a member, but also EU member states have issues over competing with one another in this area. So, ultimately, to what extent is this a very different kind of problem, or is it not something, in a nuance, yes, but ultimately something that also EU member states are facing with regard to any ambition in the EU Commission? If you could help sort of shape the thinking around these two things a little bit. And then we bring it back to Juha, because we need to also think and discuss the US elections, a question that was also raised in the chat. Richard.
Thank you. And I mean, those are great questions, and really preoccupying questions. I mean, just to say one thing, which I think is a real negative, is that I think the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is actually a bit of a barrier rather than a vehicle for working together much more closely, because it was obviously drawn very narrowly on the basis that the British government wanted it drawn very narrowly. But I see that actually is quite an obstacle to working together quite closely. I mean, it's as we're all well aware, those frameworks are not good frameworks for talking about big political issues, and they're certainly not a good framework for having the high-level political discussions on security that we need to have. So we need to break out of that framework whilst recognizing that it manages the relationship in the trade sphere. But we need to think more ambitiously than what we've got, and rather having that as our sort of reference point, because, as I say, I think it gets in the way. But there is, something I think the UK can do, frankly, to sort of help the relationship along, and that's to be much warmer on the EU-NATO relationship. In a way, it's hidden behind some of the well-known difficulties for the EU and NATO working together much more closely. I mean, they have a very well-developed relationship, but there are barriers to taking that relationship further. I think the UK could do more to ease that. I think the UK also needs to think harder about what a European pillar of NATO looks like, and how the non-EU member states of NATO fit with the EU's security and defence project, and how that all then works out in this sort of European pillar of NATO. That, I think, is something that think tankers can do a bit more on, but I think it's also something that the British government needs to think quite hard about. As I say, I'm not sure whether it spends as much time thinking about that, partly because it's anxious that, that in some way might undermine NATO. But I think, we've had US presidents now that make clear that that's not the case, and they're looking for us to do more. And so we'd be pushing an open door there. And it's a sensible insurance for all of us, frankly, because we don't know what future US administrations are going to look like. So that's a good place. It's a good place for us to have an honest conversation with one another. I think, my worry in a way is to your point about the defence industrial, is that, the defence industrial discussion in Brussels and the way it's framed, being closely coupled to the single market. I understand why that's the case, but, the defence market has never been like the single market. I mean, it's always operated on a very different basis. And in a way, it's quite unhelpful to frame it in those terms. I mean, it needs to be framed, obviously, in terms of how we get the maximum European bang for our euro or pound, frankly, and how we deal with the well-known problems of a weakness in that area, and how we scale up what we do. Part of the solution is how we work with Ukraine. and that's why it's sort of commendable that the EU has seen that and worked that through. And I think that many of the issues of how we work across border more effectively to make things happen more quickly need to be solved practically, because there's a practical problem to be solved. But I think it was very unfortunate the way that the defence industrial strategy has been written, that makes it very difficult for the UK to be involved. And I just wonder whether that's an area in which a bit of political capital could be expended to retool that. Industry works across borders, and works UK and others across Europe. We need to make that easier rather than make it more difficult. Even though the politics are difficult, and I recognise that. And some member states, one member state in particular, obviously has a particular view as to how that might evolve. So I think we've got a big enough job of work to do, where we do see a very strong coincidence between the preoccupations of Brussels and the preoccupations of London. On NATO, on the defence industrial, and we shouldn't let, in a way, our anxiety about stepping out of line when it comes to whether the UK should fit in a pre-existing framework of cooperation with a third country to dictate what we might want to do. But that requires, political leadership, frankly.
And we have Richard, we have a question and comment by a participant, Mark Piper, saying ambition is key, but on a very practical level, EU-UK relations are currently relegated to any other business in council meetings. Seems difficult to achieve even modest progress on different files. I wonder how much this is simply due to domestic political contexts, if that could be briefly touched upon. So it seems to me that current governments in France and Germany do not have political capital to spend, and Brexit is still too recent for the UK government to seriously build back bridges. Does that reflect your thinking?
I mean, I'm an observer like others here on this call as to what goes on in some national capitals, and sometimes scratch my head as to whether the sort of short-termism is really going to hold us in good stead for the challenges that we face. But look, we cannot, frankly, afford the luxury of a sort of intra-European family squabble to get in the way of the major security challenge that we face. And I fully recognise that there are difficulties in national capitals because of the preoccupations they have. Maybe the one of the things that hasn't sort of penetrated as much as it might is the UK does think about the relationship with the EU as a foreign policy relationship now. There isn't any residue of the idea that the UK, in some way has, special rights as a former member. I mean, I think in some sense the UK's moved on a little bit more than may have happened in some quarters. It's not to say that the word Brexit doesn't pop up, but it's not as gripping as it was in the past. And I think it might be good if we tried to change the frame of reference a bit, whilst recognizing that historians have got a lot to pick over in terms of where we come from. We want to stop looking in the rearview mirror and start, looking at the challenges which are there in front of us. And having a change of government in the UK provides political cover to do that, frankly. And that's the opportunity that should be grabbed.
Well, thanks. Let me bring this back to Juha and say there's political momentum also on the side of the EU, and some of the issues that were raised. Please give your perspective, Juha. And then we have probably about 7 minutes left to discuss briefly about the US. And this is already great. We see there is a lot more in there, and the EPC will continue to engage. A great proof is this conversation. But Juha, you have the floor.
Yes, very briefly, I think when we're discussing European security and the European pillar within NATO. So I think it kind of strikes, to me at least, very obvious, and of course many of the colleagues as well, that if one built a European pillar in NATO, the biggest or the second biggest military power of Europe, it's very difficult to exclude from any plans to do so in practical terms. So I think this is obviously something where, of course, the UK and in the UK-EU relations in the field of security and defense also becomes a very important. When looking at the the defense industry and defense industrial base side, I think it's kind of interesting to note in a way that this is of course something which has been spotted in London, obviously because of the well-known big defense industry of the UK. And I think it's kind of interesting to note that the UK analysis as well as the government have kind of spotted the potential structural change that is taking place. So of course we all know within the EU side there is the dissatisfaction that the EU has not been able to move fast enough, or the Europeans have not been able to move fast enough when it comes to supporting Ukraine, production of ammunition, for instance, and so forth. This is very much a debate here, but the kind of the structural changes that might take place or are kind of taking place are the ones that we have seen now. It's not any more traditional defense cooperation between the member states. It's a regulation proposed by the Commission, approved by the Council and the European Parliament, which kind of shapes the EU's defense market. And I think this is kind of, it's still early days, but anyway, this is something what the UK has spotted. And this is, of course, then bringing in the kind of the thorny questions of how to arrange the relationship between these two kind of markets, how to bring them together and work together. And here we come into the same kind of difficult questions that we had during the Brexit process. I think it's also important to note that, of course, UK is participating in many European defense projects already. And I think it's also been highlighted that should the EU move forward with its plans on the defense industrial base and all the regulation and the market ideas behind it, this could, of course, potentially lead also further fragmentation if one of the big defense market is kind of excluded or outside of it. And I think this is something where I think, and I hope as well as Richard, that the political capital will be invested. But as already discussed, and also Richard pointed out, that this is, of course, something which creates divisions within the member states. And here, of course, then the question to what extent capitals are willing to invest political capital for this is a question. I think some of the recent examples, for instance, the Czech initiative for the ammunition procurement provides sort of some positive analysis to that. So there was a tough discussions and member states hold their positions, and there was a compromise in the end. But it tells you something about how difficult this is. This is also within the EU member states to address, and of course what Almut also has highlighted. This is kind of early phase in the EU, and it's an open question how far, for instance, this institutional cycle is able to move on, especially with the kind of the structural change side of it, meaning defense market integration.
Juha, can I just, this is terrific, and we are also, you're also helping us hugely shaping some of our project work that we're aiming to do at the EPC. Just one thing that is for certain is that there are going to be US presidential elections, and this was raised by Fred in the chat as well. What can we expect? Arguably, it will be somehow, and I don't want to sound cynical, but more difficult even for Europeans to pull themselves together in delivering on security with an election result that might look like more of the same, and that is usually a democratic vote from the European angle of things. Do you agree with that? And how do you look from an EU perspective at the US presidential elections, in particular with regard to the discussion we're having today? What does it mean? What would it mean, any outcome for relations between the EU and the UK? Bringing them closer together, making them easier or more complicated? What is sort of your hunch? And then I would like to bring that question also back to Richard, and we need to wrap it up afterwards.
Well, of course, depending the results, there will be a second Trump administration. So, of course, that could turn out to be a divisive factor for Europe in general, but also for the EU to some extent. I think those discussions We have had those for more than over a year now. But I think it's also significant, and what I find problematic at the moment is that to what extent there is political leadership in the EU or more broadly in Europe to kind of to address the outcome of the elections and also what might come then after. And of course, you know, I think the early before UK went into the elections, there was a kind of a worries that the UK will actually be in the election cycle after the US elections. Now it seems like that Paris and Berlin after the European Parliament elections are kind of in a very difficult position, and one stable government with a clear mandate in Europe is outside of the EU, and that's the UK. So I think this question, where the political leadership comes from, especially in the field of security and defense, is a big question for the in light of the elections. If the outcome is that there would be significant changes in US position towards Europe, as well as towards Russia's war of aggression and the situation in Ukraine. And I think this is, of course, maybe something which is on the table when President Biden is meeting the E3, so to say, which has to some extent been not so visible as was expected during the Brexit negotiations sometimes, and of course, you know, these kind of preparations might come up from there. But of course, it's a difficult and speculative issue to discuss about, because then we don't have a clear picture what the US policies will be after the election, and there is of course this discussion as well that one should not talk too much about those potential changes and responses as they might feed into also the political debates in the US. So I think many of us think tankers are just having this wait and see, preparing for the outcome, and then take it from there, as well as I would believe the European governments as well, and the EU. The role what the European Commission can play in this, of course, and this is maybe more in the Brussels bubble, is in a way whether the leadership now, especially in the beginning of the new institutional cycle, will actually come from the Commission and the Commission President, who is potentially one of the strongest Commission presidents that we have seen for a long time. So this is of course something what we can keep in mind, and also the kind of the fact that the biggest member states seem to be aligning behind the Commission. I think this was already the previous Commission, but whether that continues is of course an important question for the
terrific. A lot of questions and a lot of shifting ground. Thank you so much for your assessment, Juha. Let me bring this back to Richard real quick. And we know it is a debate that we cannot finish here today. Yeah. I wish we could somehow, but.
Well, I mean, I think we're all aware that the US makes the geopolitical weather for us as Europeans, and in a way the UK feels that weather harder than most European states, because our nuclear deterrent is dependent on our relationship with the United States. Our intelligence sector relies on its very heavy relationship with the United States, and we've become more embedded with AUKUS more recently. So the UK is in a particular place where it has a very obviously has a shared set of concerns, if you like, with other European states, but it has its own particularities. I think it would have been better if we'd had a bit more time between the UK general election and the US election, maybe to be a bit more confident about what the EU-UK relationship might be in this area. But if we get a Harris administration, then I think they're going to encourage us to work together much more closely, so we can think of that as a positive. If we get a Trump administration, it will be an encouragement for us to work together much more closely to mitigate Trump. So whatever the outcome might be, if you're a glass half full kind of guy, you think that it may lead to a little bit more positive encouragement to work more closely together.
Listen, thank you very much, Richard Whitman, Juha, Jokela, and all participants here. This was a wonderful debate. I feel there are a lot of questions, and they are very relevant in light of the security situation in Europe. So I would like to thank you for joining this morning, for making your contributions. Give a virtual applause to our speakers. I can say we at the EPC, we are going to pursue this subject, no least in the framework of our new DefSec EU project, which you might be already aware of. This will also have a pillar that looks at evolving EU-UK relations, and we're hoping to make a contribution here. Thank you again to Richard Whitman, Juha, Jokela. Thanks to the events team at the EPC, the colleagues around Tatjana Kaftea, and also to Maria Matisiute, who is contributing researcher to this series and to many other matters in the framework of the DefSec EU project. I wish us all a good end of the week, and looking forward to re-engaging in a different and next format, hopefully also in person at some stage. Thank you again to both of you.